Welcome back to Power of the Mind, where we give you simple tools to improve your relationship with yourself and with others. Today we talk about anxiety and depression from a little bit of a different angle. We talk about some of the more subtle things that can cause and create both anxiety and depression. And we talk about, of course, different tools that a person might use to solve those problems if they've been around some of these more subtle causes. Hope you stay tuned and enjoy.
Hey everybody, welcome to Cast 11, Power of the Mind, presented by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. What's up, Greg?
Hi, good to see you today.
Nice to see you too. How's it going?
Going great.
Good. I'm depressed. I'm anxious.
You should talk to somebody.
Yeah, I think I will.
Too bad you don't know any therapists, huh?
I do, and actually I get free therapy every week, so let's dive in.
I don't think technically it would be called therapy. I might get in trouble if I gave somebody free therapy every week.
All right. I utilize it as my therapy session every week.
Well, I'm glad the goal of the podcast obviously is to provide information that's helpful to people, and I'm glad it's helpful.
It is. It's, get out of my head, Greg. Get out of my head, Greg. So, as people have learned that we do this little podcast, people are always asking questions and, probably trying to get a little therapy.
Sure.
So, one of the questions,
out, so.
Right? It's complicated.
It's
a complicated being. So, suffering from anxiety and depression, it's affecting day-to-day life. What can they do?
Man, well, there's a lot. When somebody says I'm suffering from anxiety and depression, that's the very beginning of the conversation as far as getting to the origin of something clinically. There are a lot of things that contribute to anxiety and depression. One of the first things that's really interesting to note is the idea that we shouldn't be having anxiety is really not accurate. Okay. So the idea, I always tell my clients, I say, your brain, your biology is probably even a better way of putting it than your brain. Your biology does not give a shit if you're happy. Your biology could care less about whether you're happy. It wants to know that you're going to be alive tomorrow or even just in an hour. And so that's its first priority. If it feels like you'll probably stay alive for a while, then it'll give you a chance and step aside and allow you a chance to try to look toward feeling sort of happy. The other big challenge I've been having with clients lately is in the culture because of, we don't need to get too deep into the why of it, but in the culture, we don't have a real clear-cut definition or distinction rather between happiness and pleasure. Okay? Because something is pleasurable does not mean it will make me happy. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite is true. So I have a lot of folks who have anxiety or depression in part because they're pursuing things that are pleasurable with the expectation that they'll make them happy. Sex comes to mind, right? Lots of folks get on Tinder and sleep with everybody they can, and they say, why do I feel, kind of down and depressed? Well, one of the side effects of having lots and lots of sex with lots and lots of people is you get physically connected, but emotionally it tends to feel a little empty. And I've found that folks who engage, maybe not everybody, right? But many of the folks that I've worked with who engage in sex with large quantities of people, they find themselves actually feeling even more isolated and even more distant from other folks. And that's a great example. And it's not immediately apparent. And there's certainly no place that I can think of where a person can go to get that information. Even most therapists, I don't think now are talking about the idea that engaging in that kind of behavior will often result in a sense of emptiness and kind of loneliness. It increases my loneliness. So that's one example. Another example for anxiety is the idea that the human nervous system is really just wired to detect threat. When you're born, your brain goes through a pruning process, and there's more to it than this. This is sort of an oversimplification, but more or less what happens is when you're born, your brain decides, I'm in a safe environment. Let's look for safe things. Or I'm in a dangerous environment. Let's look for dangerous things. And it prunes off the unnecessary parts of itself and stays focused on whatever seems relevant. But even if you're born into an environment that is relatively safe, and a lot of us are comparatively, again, biologically talking about over the last, tens of thousands of years, where many of us are born in an environment that is pretty safe, the survival mechanism is still there, and it's still going to find the biggest threat in your environment. The biggest threat in your environment might be really pretty minimal, but it's not to you. Right? I had a client one time, and I think I may have talked about, I'll disguise the client just a little bit, for privacy's sake. But I had a client one time, and the biggest trauma this particular client ever encountered was the betrayal of a friend. Okay, so a friend took this person. He was really close to this friend all the way through childhood, and about 16, the friend just decided they weren't going to be friends anymore, and that was it. And he turned out to be kind of a jerk, kind of a bully. But it's interesting, this guy came from an environment, a family system that was incredibly safe and structured. I knew the family through a different person. So I knew that even before we got into therapy. The parents were very safe. The neighborhood was very good. There just was a real tight sense of community. And what was fascinating is more or less the environment, by failing to expose the child to any sort of danger, had sort of failed to expose him to the idea that there is, for lack of a better term, evil in the world, right? That there are people or situations or things in the world that are not looking out for you and that might want to do you harm. It was incredibly dysregulating for him. It took him a couple of years to get through the depression that came out of that, because it was so surprising. So it's so interesting to, and again, don't mistake me as saying, everybody go out and raise your children in an environment with plenty of danger so they can learn from it. That's not at all what we're getting at here, but it is really interesting to look at in terms of, as a parent, what's my goal? Well, you raise a kid in a perfect environment and the world will shellac them. You got to prepare them for the world.
Yeah, but look at how many parents today will fight their children's battles for them.
Oh, yeah, totally.
They don't get a certain spot on the team, or they're not.
Probably happens in your world sometimes.
In my world it does, where I fight more with parents than I do with kids. And for the most part, the kids are just fine with what's going on, but the parent sees an injustice. But that's actually another really common cause of anxiety that is not well known. It's kind of fun to dig into some of the more obscure ones. But a parentified child is often tremendously anxious. Believe it or not. One of the ways, if you want to mess up a kid, make them in charge. If a kid thinks that they run the show, kids know that they're dumb. Like, we at some level know that we are vulnerable and not that bright. And we wait till adolescence before we decide we know everything about the world. A little kid is looking for guidance a lot of the time. And if you put them in an environment where the parents are moving them into where there's not effective structure or space or boundaries, they get really, really anxious. And it's interesting because a lot of the times people in their environment don't know why. Kid's tremendously anxious, no one can figure it out. And the reality is the kid doesn't feel like there are limits and boundaries. We find a tremendous amount of safety in boundaries. I worked with a client recently, and the client came from an environment where there was a lot of wealth, generational wealth. And this client had been involved in the family's company for quite some time, and the family company more or less wrapped things up, and now she came into just a ton of money. Well, the challenge that she has now, she doesn't have anything to do. And she can live anywhere, she can go anywhere, she can be friends with anybody, she can do, and it's actually more stressful to have unlimited options than it is to have severely limited options. To have no options and no sort of perception of going someplace is really dysregulating. You see that with celebrities all the time, or people that win the lottery.
Sure.
They go from nothing to, and you see so many of those, trauma stories of, what happens 6 months after they win the lottery. It's like either dead or
it's really
spent all the money. Or
one of the worst things you can do to somebody is give them $1 million. It's terrible for people.
It sucks.
Well, what I read one time, and I have found to be true as I've talked with clients, it's so interesting to sit in my chair, right? Because I've worked with people who are homeless all the way up to billionaires, and you discover, like, money doesn't build character, it just magnifies it. And power is the same way. It doesn't build character. Power actually is very tempting. When you get exposed to a lot of power, you'll find parts of the unconscious mind that you're not aware of. The nastier parts of the psyche can come up pretty fast in that situation. And money and power can be very tightly woven together. But whatever your character defects are, if you get some money, you'll find out what they are very quickly. If you feel pride, whatever it is, it can be very challenging. But yeah, having too many options is incredibly stressful and challenging. But back to this thing with the parent piece, right? So when a parent defines a part of themselves in a child, we call that enmeshment. And we talked about enmeshment a few episodes ago when we were talking about family systems. So enmeshment is when who you are and who I am are kind of blended together. And when you feel pain, I feel pain. When you feel good, I feel good. And the challenge is that we can't be honest. It's really hard to tell the truth. It's hard for a kid to tell the truth if a parent is enmeshed with them. So if I know that I am the more emotionally stable of the two of us, and you're my mom, I can't tell the truth to you, or you'll fall apart. And if you fall apart, guess what? My biology will not let me do that. Prior to the age of 12 or 11, if you fall apart, biology says, man, you're not gonna get to eat. This gal, this guy, these parents you have, they're responsible for feeding you. Take care of them if they need to be taken care of. If they need you to do well in school, do well in school. Now, once in a while, about 20% of the time, 10% of the time, you'll get a kid who'll rebel and say, I'm not doing that for anybody. People come out of the womb, I think, with a certain disposition toward how agreeable they're going to be. And some kids are harder than others, for sure. But a lot of the time, if a parent needs a lot of success from their kid, the kid will make a decision at the age of like 2 or 3 to go along with the game, and then they can't say no. And it's tremendously stressful and challenging. And that's a lot of the time what you're finding with a lot of anxiety and depression is people being enmeshed with their parents and sometimes not even know that it's true.
Do you see it more in so I can think of a couple examples. I don't want to voice them too much, but is it more of like single children homes, like just you're an only child and you're the whole world?
Oh yeah, being an only child is really hard. What we don't recognize always about only children is they seem entitled, but they're also profoundly lonely. Mm-hmm. They grow up very alone in a world full of adults who have stuff to do. And now they all have iPads, which some people lament, but compared to the alternative, which is just to be by yourself, what did they do before? They read books, maybe that's better. Or they just sat around. I mean, it can be really, really tough to be an only child. Sorry, I interrupted you though.
No, I was just thinking about some of the ones I've seen that are the most, I guess the most enmeshed would be like the kind of the older parents with an only child.
Sure.
And maybe because they have more money and so they're able to do more for their kids, but yeah, it's crazy because the more when you speak that, I think about the kids that have been kind of, the apple of the eye, and you critique them once and it's like they don't know how to handle critique. They don't know how to handle even praise. They're very confused by both, so.
Yeah, I don't know if I've found a generality or a particular, I've seen single parent households with multiple kids where the kids come out great because mom's doing a great job, although that's a lonely job. Being a single mom, people forget that part. People glamorize it sometimes, but man, oh man, being at home with an infant without somebody to come home and I just can't. I've so many clients over the years who we've talked to who just suffer in that environment. And people can make it through, you can do it. But I've seen kids come out of environments like that and just be very resilient and strong and have a strong sense of identity and not be particularly anxious or depressed. And I've seen kids come out of environments of, it's really interesting. There's not, how a human being responds to their environment is very challenging to predict. Much more so than one might imagine. But so to answer your question, I don't know if I see a particular pattern, but you know it when you see it. Mm-hmm. And it's really challenging for the kids, and it's actually challenging into adulthood. You don't develop a sense of you don't individuate, you don't develop a sense of autonomous self a lot of the time when you come out of that environment. And a lot of times you see the midlife crisis, for example, when somebody has a real strong, powerful midlife crisis, often they're responding to the expectations of their parents, and they're finally getting to a point where sometimes they've met or exceeded the expectations, and they realize, kind of like that client I was thinking of, talking about a minute ago, like, wow, there's limitless opportunity and I have everything I need, and now what? Where the hell do I go now? What do I do with myself now? Mm-hmm. Good Lord. So yeah, the other challenge you have is you can get on Instagram, and my profession in general has promoted the idea of trying to make a child's life free of trauma, which is actually pretty nice, especially compared to the opposite of it. But there's a balance to it. Ultimately, one of the best guideposts that a person can get to is like working with a kid to parent them to. We have to remember that the goal of a parent is to get a kid to function in society and culture. And that means they have to essentially learn to share their toys. And that means they have to learn to play well with others. And so as a parent, when I try to protect my kid from those, we just have to make sure we're looking at like what we're doing from a social perspective. And we can really overdo the lack of interference and discipline. So there's a difference between discipline and punishment. Punishment is when I use power to make you feel less than in an effort to extinguish your behavior. And it's not a good plan. People who are punished rebel. Another way of putting it is if you try to control my behavior, I will usually work with you. If you try to control my thoughts, I will rebel. It's another sort of guidepost with that. Discipline is where I use the least invasive and the least sort of damaging intervention I can, but I get the message across. No, we don't throw our toys. No, we don't hit people. No, we don't yell. No, we don't interrupt. And different kids, that's the other challenge, is you want to write a book, we're like, okay, this is the only thing you can do. This is the recipe. But the problem is different kids are very, very different in their dispositions. I hang around, I taught at a daycare center, my first job out of undergrad. And I didn't like it very much, but my girlfriend got me the job and I was kind of lazy. And whenever I submitted my resume, back then we had to do it on pieces of paper. It would just go away forever. No one called me. So I thought, well, I'll just take this job. Turned out to be really educational. Yeah. I learned a ton. I had 15 preschool kids. And so that's the thing, is the dispositions are dramatically different, even within families, even from kid to kid. One kid, you say, hey, quit it. And they just, okay. Another kid, man, we have to have a long, long conversation, maybe a little slap on the behind to wake you up and remind you like, hey, this is real. This is serious, And the challenge you have with that kind of a kid is those are leaders later. But you don't do them any favors if you don't give them limits. You don't do them any favors, you don't teach them that fire burns and water gets wet. Mm-hmm. And that's what you see a lot of times. And it's actually getting to the point where it's in the education system in general at times. The lack of accountability when we're persecuting teachers who hurt students' feelings, that is a problem. That is not a recipe for a culture that works, and it's not a recipe for adults. Like that's the biggest challenge we see, in my opinion. If you wanted to broadly generalize the damage that my profession has done to the culture, is infantilization. Having people come out of the school system as children in adult bodies, being protected. Having the world eventually will not protect you, and the longer you protect somebody from the world, the less prepared they are for it. The world is big and cold.
Yeah, and as parents, you cannot. I remember the first time that I couldn't do anything for my kid. She got in trouble at school, and she's like, "Mom, I didn't mean to break the rule, but I did," and she was going to face a consequence. And it was a big smack in the head for me the moment that I learned I can't protect her from this. She's going to have to face the consequences, and there was nothing I could do. But, it's just as parents, it's hard to...
Oh, it's brutal.
It's hard to let your kids go and, and just let them face the world, because it's, better. Like, you've been through it, and you want to tell them, you want to protect them, but gosh, they got to...
Especially the stubborn ones.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple of those. So if you see, because I'm wondering, like with anxiety, are you born, like anxiety comes upon you and you're living with it now and it's part of your life? Or I was born with no anxiety and now all of a sudden I have anxiety?
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I think the idea, so you're talking really philosophically about a concept called tabula rasa, born with a clean slate. Yes. And that was a philosophy, I can't remember the philosopher's name. It was him and the other guy. Anyway, there was a philosopher, darn it, I can't remember it, but a couple philosophers, and they were talking about, I should ask Google.
Born with
tabula
a clean
rasa.
slate.
Give me the philosopher. John Locke. Yes, John Locke.
We got many Googles around here.
Influential,
Thank you, Siri.
Very influential philosopher, and he brought up the idea that we come into the world kind of empty and then get programmed, and that doesn't seem to be true. That doesn't hold true in my observation. you can't come out and say scientifically this is the answer. And you can do that with very little in psychology. It's not too hard to find both sides of pretty much every answer in psychology. You can do that with some stuff. But the other challenge with psychology is it wants to be a hard science like botany or something. But it's not, because human beings are different every time. Two people can walk through the exact same thing and come out very differently. And the number of exogenous factors, the number of factors that we can't analyze is too strong. So all that to be said, it does look like people come into the world with a certain number of traits. And those traits extend both biologically, like I'm tall, right? I happen to be tall. And also psychologically. I happen to be perhaps more stubborn than one person or another. Like that seems like it shows up right away. There's some interesting research that says the sex drive can do that as well. There's a biological component to sex drive, and there's two components. Well, male sex drives are actually pretty simple. It's like an on-off switch. Not a lot to it. The female sex drive appears to have at least two strong components. And this is, again, we're wandering a little off the reservation here, but there's brakes and gas. So the brake system says things aren't working well, slow everything down, stop. And the gas system is just fires everything up. And you can actually have like high brakes and high gas, where you have a strong libido, but the slightest thing going wrong in the process shuts everything down. You can also have high brakes and low gas, and that's interesting because you have a strong libido and very little will get in your way. That can be problematic at times. Though the culture would tell you that it's all well and good to sleep with everybody, anybody, anytime you want, the reality is the attachment system, it's pretty hard to do that without causing harm. Even if you get, people talk about being polyamorous all the time now. And my argument with polyamory, I've had some clients who've explored it and found it to be great, but I've never once run into somebody who's able to not cause harm. Now, maybe them and their partner can decide, hey, we're in this together and we're doing a great time. But sooner or later, somebody gets jealous or somebody gets harmed in the process, right? In my exploration of my sexual stuff, I end up sleeping with somebody else who's harmed by our experience one way or the other. So that's the challenge. It's really, really challenging. Sex is very powerful. And I got off track here. What were we talking about? Oh, traits. So yes.
Always get derailed by
get a little bit off track. Sex. Yeah, is it sex most of the time?
I think it is.
See. What can I say? Yeah. So the traits of a person when they're born, there appear to be quite a bit more of who we are that is hardwired when we showed up than we'd like to admit. It's also not as much fun to acknowledge that in my profession, because my profession specializes in the influence of the family system on the personality. And so the idea that biology might play a considerable role, it's just sort of outside the scope a little bit. So I don't know. I wandered a little bit on that, but I think it kind of answered the question as far as
I know right now it's like it's kind of popular to have anxiety or depression, and I think it kind of clouds the people who are really struggling with that too.
I think that is one of the challenge.
Yeah, I think it's kind of cool, right?
I saw a comedian the other day. He said everybody wants to be he said the F word. I won't say the F word on the podcast. Everybody wants to be a effing victim. And the problem is when you do that, you miss the real victims. The real victims get lost in the shuffle. I thought, wow, that's something. There might be something to that. My observation is that being the victim and putting the responsibility for what's happening to you onto the outside world is always the basis of almost all pathology. And there's a real challenge attached to that. That said, I think it can be a challenge. So the thing is, with everybody having anxiety and depression, there's two kinds of depression. There's biological depression, which is more or less a result of an imbalance of some chemicals in your brain. And by the grace of God, say what you want about Big Pharma. They're a mess. They do terrible things some of the time. Mm-hmm. But they have invented some pretty cool drugs. And those drugs can take people who otherwise would have been condemned to a life of hellish depression, or at the very least, a life where they experience gray and the rest of us see in color. And because of these drugs, they can have a life. And they can do great. And one of the things with biological depression is when you treat it with medication, it gets better often, I think, pretty quick. The other kind of depression is about anger turned inward. Well, if you're an adolescent, you're mad about a lot. All anger is the emotion attached to the thought, this isn't fair. Well, geez, there's just not much that's fair about being a kid. It sucks to be a kid. People telling you what to do all the time. People, I mean, it's a bad deal.
Yeah.
Kids are mean to each other. Parents are mean to kids. Adults are mean to kids. I mean, it's a rough deal. So it's not hard to get resentful and to have that resentful turn inward. That's all depression is from a psychological perspective. And that's not to minimize it. Sometimes it can be very difficult. And sometimes life can be profoundly unfair. And you'll see that a lot. I see that a lot with my clients. Many of them have been through things that are deeply, deeply unfair. Mm-hmm. And I tell them, I say, you come by your depression honestly. And if you want out, you know, the pathway involves just taking a look at what happened and what is and learning to accept it. There's often a grief process attached to that. And then there's the other challenge is resentment comes from the belief that something's not fair. Well, the reality is the world doesn't care as much about you as you think it should, as a general rule. And some people try to change that on a cultural level and make the world fairer. So far, that has only resulted in challenge and more difficulty, right? I'm tall. Somebody else might decide that because they're short, that's not fair.
Right.
There's not much you can do about it. And that's a lot of, what we do when we have somebody who has depression is we try to figure out, what is your responsibility and how much of this is about something you can control and how much of it is about your belief system. And then you do what you can do and you change your belief system about the rest, and that's it. It's the $10. So there you go. That's the $10 approach to changing depression. You just got all your depression cured right there for anybody you want.
So for me, I hear, my kids will tell me, I'm having an anxiety attack.
Yeah.
What is an anxiety attack?
An anxiety attack is when the fight-flight system comes on board. The formal definition of an anxiety attack, what your kids mean and what an anxiety attack is might be different. Mm-hmm. But if your fight-flight system comes on board and it says, get the hell out of here, your nervous system will mobilize in really remarkable ways so that you can run away. If you do that and there's no reason for it, you'll be very confused and you will have what's traditionally called an anxiety attack. And you'll feel like you're crawling out of your skin. And sometimes you run. I can think of a client I had. It was a vet, been wounded in combat. And he'd walk into the grocery store and 3 times he'd walk in and be fine. The 4th time he'd walk in, pushing his cart around and have to run outside. And he said, and he was real hard on himself and very much a man's man, and said he just felt very weak. And so he was actually depressed. This is a good example of the depression thing. He was very depressed about the fact that he was having panic attacks and that his nervous system would take over. And he would run his ass out of the Circle K. He'd be at the corner store and somebody would slam a door and he'd have to run away and go hide in his car for a while until he settled down. So that's an anxiety attack, is the process of moving into a complete state of nervous system overwhelm.
So if it's something where there's no threat, it's just self-perceived maybe, or something has triggered it? Sometimes
it's self-perceived, or sometimes there's a reaction that's not, that doesn't make sense given the stimulus, given what's happening.
And so with an anxiety attack, I've heard, maybe heart racing, sweaty, just heavy breathing.
Tunnel vision, heavy breathing, feel like you're popping out of some people feel like they're popping out of their body, like they're up high watching everything happen in front of them. So at what point, because this person was talking about like their day-to-day. So this is now affecting my day-to-day. Yeah. How can they is it always counseling? Is it always medication? Is there something, how do we? Well, the answer to the question always has to do with the diagnosis. That's why a professional who is seasoned and understands what they're doing is very helpful, because you can treat anxiety lots of ways. If I give you some benzodiazepines, you feel much better very quickly. The problem is you develop a tolerance to them. There's tissue dependency, so when you withdraw from them, you can die. Wow. It's really a bad deal. And that was the standard pharmacological approach to anxiety for a long time. We'll get you on this addictive substance that'll settle you down right away.
And you can never get off of it, right?
It can be very, very problematic. And then when it was time to get off of it, guess what the withdrawal symptoms were? Severe, severe anxiety. So that's kind of a crapper deal.
Yeah.
Basically, we're kicking the can down the road. So that's kind of fallen out of fashion now more lately. But there are a variety of different tools and techniques you can use, but a lot of it depends on what's happening. Often, not always, often you're talking about a PTSD response. So I have an event from my past that is being triggered. And so some forms of trauma therapy can be helpful. I have come to the conclusion that a naturopathic doctor can be of incredible help with my clients. They're very expensive. So that's the downside is most folks aren't able to spend. A real good naturopathic workup is, $500 to $1,000, and then they'll put you on a bunch of, they all own the pharmacy, which is interesting too. So that's its own little conflict of interest in that profession. But they'll put you on a dozen different vitamins to settle things down, and it's a pain in the butt and kind of expensive. And when it works, there are times that a person's anxiety is primarily motivated by by hormones, by their hormones, by the balance of things in their nervous system. And I had a guy one time came to see me because he was depressed. And he was so down. And we worked. And I was like, what's going on in your life? Well, this or that. But nothing really stuck. And finally I said, oh, you need to go to a naturopath and figure out what your testosterone and your estrogen levels look like. And sure enough, he had estrogen levels that were really high and testosterone levels that were really low. And he got put on some supplements, and 3 weeks later we were done. Great.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of, at the end, I kind of felt bad because I was like, well, it turns out my thing was not really what you needed. but we did discover it. We did discover it eventually. But that's the interesting thing about anxiety and depression is anxiety is such a fundamental foundational system within a human being that you really have to understand the nervous system sitting in front of you before you can understand what the most valuable or best approach is. So, and for some people, they have to go through several different iterations and times to look into it.
Does it help to kind of chart, like, this is what I was doing when this anxiety hit?
Yeah, it can, absolutely. Although the number of factors can be so, I heard of a client one time who had a strong allergy to potatoes. Cut out the potato allergy, all the anxiety's gone.
So there's so many things that can bring this on. My gosh.
And so, again, I don't mean to overwhelm anybody who's listening or wanting to get some help. A lot of times just some basic therapy can handle a person. And, oftentimes the expectation level from childhood has been very high and put on somebody. Or the kid is, the kid will decide themselves they need to be the best at what they're doing in order to be somebody. Everybody wants to be somebody. And that's just a reality of the psyche. We'd rather be the worst than nobody. I'd rather be, if I can't be the best at this, I'll try to be the best at something else, or maybe I'll try to be the worst. Everybody has to have an identity or a place where they fit in the world, where they see themselves in the drama, the movie in their brain. And a lot of times that process can create a lot of anxiety. So I'm bringing up some obscure examples, but the reality is most times, particularly with young people, most times the solution is traditional psychotherapy can be of great help. Sitting with someone, normalizing their experience, letting them know that what's happening to them is maybe less important than it feels like it is. Those sorts of things can all have a tremendous benefit.
Yeah, it's kind of like a process of elimination. You talk to a therapist and it's like, okay, we don't have underlying situations that are causing this. Maybe then a homeopathic.
Sure, there's all kinds of different directions you can go. But 90% of the time, you can just talk to somebody and kind of get it sorted out. Or you decide you live with it. Because at the end of the day, I don't know of anybody who lives a life without anxiety. There probably are some people, but it's rare, except you.
I had a dream I had anxiety.
Wow.
In my dream, I was getting those symptoms where I was like, I was super stressed about something. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I pulled myself out of the dream and I was like, well, that was weird. Because I felt like what I would assume was an anxiety attack in my dream, which I thought was very crazy. But it was just, but it's hard for me because I have people in my life that have anxiety and they'll tell me like, I'm freaking out. I'm like, calm down. Just calm down. So it's hard for me. I'm trying to be better. You're making me you're making me a better me. But
well, that's the goal anyway of the podcast, is so we can all learn and discover that stuff. What you might discover is that your anxiety appears to be situational. So in your life, you have a lot of things going for you, right? You're successful professionally. You're successful at home. And that by itself is enough to put somebody into a space where they don't have any anxiety. Is an alert. Hey, something is wrong. Someone is in, there could be trouble here.
Yeah.
Anxiety at a foundational level is designed to keep your ass alive. That's what it does. So if you've built a life, and you can do this with responsible living and hard work, and you can build a life where there isn't a lot going wrong at any given time. And if you believe in yourself to a certain degree, you believe that if something does go wrong, I can probably handle it.
I'll fix it.
Yeah. So from what you've talked about with your family of origin, you've been somebody, and your IQ is high. Like, you have that going for you too. So the reality is, you can look at a difficult situation, see the solution, and more or less find or fight your way to it.
Yeah.
If we put you into a situation where one of those areas was threatened, you might discover that you have more anxiety than you realize, right? You might discover, where your perception of, or the other thing that can happen to people is they'll have some sort of earth-shattering event where
earth-shattering event.
That was timed really well, actually. Some sort of earth-shattering event where they find out that the context of their life is different than what they thought, and that can take a lot of it apart. So, not that I anticipate that in your life, of course, but you see that sometimes.
But I think there's something to be said with, like you said, my family of origin, I was always in charge of everything and making sure. So there was no time to be anxious. Like, you can't do that.
Yeah. Well, and frankly, you being anxious, like, probably everybody melt down.
Oh, my kids always say, if mom's freaking out, run for the attic because it's going down. Like,
exactly.
It's going to be bad.
Right. So that's a valuable role in a family system and of great benefit. And underneath it, the process of anxiety. I had a friend, for example, I was just thinking about this. I had a friend who discovered after the death of his parents that one of his dad wasn't his dad. Oh. It was somebody else completely. Well, that's a paradigm shifting event. Mm-hmm. To discover that your parents, who are both dead now, lied to you for your entire life. One knowingly, one probably unknowingly, but you don't know. And the guy was his dad is dead too. So no answers. Right?
So I have a real life story on that I'd like to talk about next time.
Okay, cool. Sounds great.
Mm-hmm. Real, totally real. So
this is also a real story.
Well, I know, but I mean, like, I could share all those facts with you.
That sounds like fun.
I'd love to hear it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. Let's do that next time.
Okay.
All right.
This is awesome. So depression, anxiety, real. And I know that.
Yep.
And it's not, and there's many triggers or many things that can cause it, right? So
let me think of Mr. Rogers for a minute there. There are many ways to have depression and anxiety. I don't think that's the song, actually, really.
I'm going to guess no.
That's not what he's saying, no.
Probably could have been.
I think a lot of our problems could be solved with Mr. Rogers. I think more Mr. Rogers.
Puppets.
More Mr. Rogers in the life of our children would solve a lot.
Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, and some puppets.
My kids, we had them watch Mr. Rogers when they were little. And I didn't like it when I was a kid. I was too ADD to enjoy it. But as an adult, I really did. So anyway.
Simpler time for sure. So, all right. So bottom line, if you're feeling anxious, depressed,
hey, Granite Mountain, man. GraniteMountainBHC.com. Call the outpatient department and get yourself taken care of.
Especially when there's, when it's turning a little darker, or when it's, give you guys a call.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much for educating me and our listeners, as always, because it's out there. It's not going away anytime soon.
No.
You guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Power of the Mind on Cast 11 with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare and Greg Struve.
See you next time.
Guys. Yep.
For information about mental health and addiction treatment, you can reach out to Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare online at GraniteMountainBHC.com. That's GraniteMountainBHC.com. Or give us a call at 877-338-6287. That's 877 338-6287. If you have a comment about this podcast or a question you'd like us to address in the podcast, you can check out the Contact Us page at my website, gregstruve.com. That's GregStruve, as in Victor, E as in Edward.com. This has been a Cast 11 production brought to you by Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. This episode was produced by Austin Morrison. Follow Cast 11 on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Talking Glass Media.